Thank you everyone for being here for the final session of our Mentoring Mondays with Messer Construction. The previous two sessions were recorded, so we're going to make sure that we can share that with you if you haven't been able to watch that from the beginning. But we're really grateful for this partnership. A lot of great information has been shared, and we're looking forward to this session on contracting and risk mitigation. Thanks, Mike.
Well, thank you, Annette, and thank you all for allowing us to share with you today more about contracting and risk mitigation. So I'll be joined by Matt Poland as well as we get into the presentation. I'm Mike Schneider with Messer Construction and have been with Messer for going on 20 years now. So we're delighted to become partners with MBDA and learn more about the minority and business owned communities here in our community and learn how we can align together in future projects. So with that, I'll give an overview of the company and move into a little bit of our DEI program, and then we'll jump into the top five risks that we would want to talk to, and we're open to making this dialogue between us and the audience here today to ensure that if there are questions or comments that you have, feel free to share those as we go through the presentation. So this is our third of the three-part series, and today we're going to be talking about contracting and risk mitigation. Before we do that, just a quick overview on Messer for those that are new in the audience today. Move on to the next slide here. So Messer's 90 years old, founded originally in Cincinnati, Ohio, back in 1932. We are a construction manager and general contractor and serve 10 regions throughout the Midwest and Southeast, with our 11th region scheduled to open next year in Greenville, South Carolina. Currently at about 1,300 employees. And as far as volume of work in our market segments, we focus in 6 different market segments. The aviation, so we currently have work at RDU that is scheduled. Currently doing work at Charlotte Douglas. Just wrapped up a contract up at CVG. Still working on a couple parking structures at B&A in Nashville. But we do quite a bit of aviation work right now. We know that infrastructure is going to be a big hot button economy that needs to grow into the future. Federal military, we also are doing work at Fort Bragg here in North Carolina, and have done a significant amount of federal military work at Wright Pat Air Force Base in Fort Knox, out of our Kentucky region. Have been with our history, our largest market segments. About 40, on any given year, 40 to 80% of our work is in. So economic inclusion as a whole. So Messer created its own department back in 2005 for our diversity economic inclusion. So the individuals that you see here are all currently positioned up in our Cincinnati office. So Stan Williams is our vice president, chief inclusion and diversity officer. Sonia Walton and Natasha support us in the Raleigh region, boots on the ground, our network. And then Stanley Warren Huffman Jr. is an economic inclusion manager who's really focused on workforce diversity externally. We've started a program up in Cincinnati that had a goal of hiring 50 individuals from the local area, Cincinnati Children's Hospital, in which that large project was being built, but employ full-time 50 individuals from that area that was economically challenged to start careers, and we were successful in doing that. And we're looking at rolling that out in Nashville in the next few months. So he's kind of taking the lead and taking that to all of our regions. We piloted that in our Cincinnati region. How do we define inclusion? As I mentioned, workforce diversity, supplier diversity, and community engagement. We are, as I said, 100% employee owned, and we have 10 regions geographically because we want our individuals to be able to go home to their family each night. So we'll do work within about a 75-mile radius, but in doing so, our individuals, as they relocate to where our work is, it's more of, that's what they call home, so we want them to thrive in that community and build the relationships for the long term. It was both. So we joined a partnership with Easter Seals and developed a training program that, after a certain period of time, kind of working as an intern or co-op, working side by side with trades, we either hired them internally to Messer or identified a subcontractor that was in need of a resource to hire and made that arrangement. Of the 35.2 million current total purchases. So right now we're looking at about 22% MWB spend in the foreseeable future. And this isn't, let me take a step that we're talking about aren't dictated by our owners. These are internal goals that we've established and targets that we strive for. We understand part of our core values is to create opportunities for those that otherwise may not have them. And we have to be very intentional about that. So our internal goals sometimes are a lot higher than even our owners' requirements, if there are any. All right. So I wanted to take a minute here just to allow those that are in attendance. The next part of the presentation will be about what we call the top 5 risk as you move from building off of our previous session. So before we had pre-qualification and then bidding. And then after bidding, you move into contractor wants to work with your owners, ready to sign you up. And so this next slides will be talking about what are some of the things to be thinking about as you move into a contract situation, and what are some of those risks to quantify, qualify before you go into a situation that you're unfamiliar with. So if there's anyone in the room at this time that has a question that or an objective that you'd like to have answered through the presentation, let us know, and we'll kind of tailor our presentation to make sure that your questions are answered. Otherwise, feel free to answer questions along the way or at the end. So the question is, would the first 2 presentations be available? And yes, those have been recorded and will be available through MBDA. Good question. Anyone else? Okay. Well, at this point, I'll let Matt introduce himself, and we'll jump into the contracting and risk mitigation objectives of the day.
Well, thank you, Mike.
You can advance the slide there, Derek.
Thank you, Mike. And if at any time you can't hear me, just please butt in and tell me to stop and restate.
One more time.
But my name is Matt Poland. I'm of course, with Messer Construction Company as well. Along with Mike, I've been with Messer for a long time, 32 years. I've worked in our Lexington, Cincinnati, and now Raleigh regions. I have experience in all of our market segments except one, which is federal military. So I bring a lot of experience and a lot of what not to do with contracting. I would like to just mention that this is just meant to be helpful, and it's for most bidding and estimating events. It's not really specific to our company or any process. And this session is more about risk, decisions, and process and responsibility. It's not intended to teach specifics around a particular trade scope of work. From a legal risk perspective, why should we care about negotiating terms? Well, I always say that it's easy to do the work. It's hard to negotiate the terms up front and what you're trying to achieve with respect to an agreement. And an agreement is just that. What are you and I going to agree on, and what can we live with? And let's get it right early and make things easier later, because typically what we want to do is, I'm just following the process. if, well, we'll get into that a little bit later, but well, with informal disputes and negotiation, mediation, arbitration, it's more, I'd much rather a horse trade on the job than ever have a dispute. And I think disputes can be mitigated by a thorough review of the scope of work that you want to purchase or that you are intended to do. Next slide. So contract terms translate to the cost of the business. Yeah, time, resources, money, reputation. What happens when you have the wrong language versus what happens when you get the language right? Next slide, please. So the incorporation by reference. So if when Messer signs a owner agreement, we incorporate that by reference into all subcontract agreements, and it's available typically upon notice. A lot of people don't request that, but what we would do if somebody does request the owner contract, we would just redact a lot of the information that regarding terms of payment and contract, but you would also be privy to know why we've included certain things in our subcontract agreement because it was mentioned in the owner agreement. So, and yet you'll also be able to understand. You'll also be able to understand what we've agreed to in the prime contract regarding retainage terms. Is it 5%? Is it 10%? Is it on a line item basis? Is it on the entire subcontract amount? And as they say in business, everything's negotiable. When we send out subcontracts, we do not like getting red lines through it, but we understand there are certain circumstances that require us to provide some give and take. Next slide, please.
Will it give feedback? Is that okay? The last bullet there about negotiating equitable terms.
Yes, well, those, yes.
So in your experience, do you see a lot of hub firms negotiating terms? What would you say overall? Do you get red line copies? Because I'm interested to hear your answer. Yeah.
What we would prefer is have 30-day terms. And some owner agreements that dictate 45, 60, and 90-day terms, and we are usually successful in reducing those times to fit within the 30-day mark. When I've said red lines, it's you can redline anything you want in a subcontract agreement. Doesn't mean that we're going to accept it, but I think that you'll find that our subcontract agreement is fair and based upon the AIA documents, and it's not there's no gotchas in there, but most or some, for instance, an elevator company, a supplier of elevators, they want down payments. Well, we will agree to down payments as long as our owner will agree to pay us 50% of the product. But if they can't, then we're not going to make special arrangements just because they need 50% down. There's instances like where there are stored materials. What is the definition of a stored material in your contract agreement? I've had some owners who, once it hits a warehouse and then you can prove that it's insured with pictures, and they would release payment for that material. There are other owners who it has to be at the job site, but it can only be they'll pay for the stored material, but then you can only bill for it as installed once it is actually on the building. So there's just different. If you don't understand,
I'll add a couple of things here as well. You know, oftentimes I think the most red lines we get are from those subcontractors or suppliers that either have an attorney within or utilizes a professional regularly to review all their subcontract agreements. And sometimes, our standard subcontract agreement is written to try to satisfy all the different circumstances or subcontractors, which, we contract $5,000 to, $10 million on subcontracts, and the diversity of the scope of the work is diverse as the companies that we subcontract. And so it's hard to capture all of those things all in one fell swoop, but, terms of insurance requirements or indemnification or protection of work, there's certain things that subcontractors want to see in all of their subcontracts, and there's certain things that we want to see in ours. And so there's oftentimes a negotiation between how can we understand what they're trying to achieve? How do we communicate what we need to have covered so that it is insurable from our perspective? We ultimately own the liability, and we find a common ground, common language. Sometimes just the choice of the words that are used can satisfy both parties. To really answer the question, how many of them come from hub contractors? Say very few comments, I think, come back from the hub contractors. It's more those that have been well established and have a larger volume of work.
Particularly something I enjoy, negotiating, especially the price down, right? It's actually why I got out of procurement and went to supplier diversity, right? But the thing is, you won't ever get a better price or term if you don't ask, right? And so all you can do is redline it and ask. So I worked with a client that was working for a corporation, and you need to have $5 million of liability, $5 million of umbrella. I forgot what I was saying. Yeah. So I mean, whether you cost share for an attorney, right? You get a special deal, you get a bookkeeper. Those are the costs of doing business and growing. So to be intentional about investing in that, right? To be able to grow. And then the other thing is knowing the terms, right? The definitions. And I think, Mike, you mentioned that, or Matt, you mentioned that. In this contract language, there's a big difference between and, right, and or, and shall and may, right? If you think about it as a parent, you say, yeah, you shall eat your dinner, right? No, you must eat your dinner, right? There's a big difference in that, in the contract language. It's those little things, if you're not planning about what can go wrong, right? And I think that's from our military training too, is what can go wrong. And if it goes wrong, who's going to fix it? And who's going to pay for it, right? Because what might seem logical to me, when that goes south, all of a sudden, well, I'm not doing that. Well, I thought no, right? And so the key part in contract and managing risk, right? And like you said, whether it's a master services agreement or whatever, it's generic, right? But there's no harm in being specific or suggesting it, because that, I think, also sends a message to the contractor, like that Messer, that says, wow, they're reading it. Wow, they're intentional. Wow, okay, they're paying attention, right? Because nobody wants to be this bad man out when something bad happen, right? But if you don't address it at first, and it's asking questions, and it's okay to ask the questions, right? But those definitions and understanding that everything is negotiable. Again, they might not like it, but we were able to close the gap, get the insurance reduced, because that was the other one, employee compensation or employee whatever. It's like they only had one person, so why do I need to have $1 million worth of coverage, right? That if I hired or if I grew, then I would agree to do that, because then I would have revenue to pay that cost, right?
Or the contractor may say, well, we can't negotiate the limits of the liability down on your policy, but we'll pay the premium portion.
Oh, really? See, I didn't know that someone would do that. Okay. So great. But it starts with that conversation, right? And that's part of building that relationship. So thanks.
Well, Annette, I think you bring up a lot of good points there. And the ones that stuck out for me is read it. Read before you bid it, read the owner agreement or the subcontract agreement. There's a reason why we spend a lot of time up front putting together what we call front-end documents. They're basically just the rules of the project and what it is that you need to provide. And a lot of times it's in tongue in cheek in our office and in most general contractors, construction managers' office, it's like, why do we write the front ends? Nobody reads them except when they get to the scope of work. But you have to know what to include in that scope of work that's above and beyond the specific items of just install flooring, install glue, prep the floor, and what about safety? What about badging? What about parking? Where most of these things are identified, and I agree with you. It's helpful to understand if you're bidding to us what we've agreed to in the owner agreement. But you bring up some good points. Okay, notice this is the most important, in my opinion, notification. From a contract administration importance, failure to give proper and timely notice can have drastic consequences. There's always risk, and notice you will not, it's not if you will send a notice on the entire project, it's when. There will always be something that comes up that you may say is harmful to what you are doing. For instance, if I'm laying up a block wall and there's a lot of sleeves that go through the wall. We got HVAC duct going through, we got piping sleeves, fire sprinkler sleeves. And I have to, and the general contractor comes to me and says, you're going to have to wait until we get all the penetrations through this wall defined on a drawing that's very detailed and has to be approved. And I can't let you proceed up any higher than 8 feet until that's done. Well, the block layer would say, well, I'm going to be done with that work tomorrow. And I had anticipated the rest of that work to be 2 more weeks. If you're telling me to stop, that's going to affect the money I had in my proposal. So I can't tell them verbally that I may have a dispute or I disagree and it's going to cause harm. So I have to do it in writing, and it has to be within a certain amount of days. And there's stipulations on if there's a possible cause for a dispute, you have to let us know within 3 days. And it's not that you have to know the exact amount and time that you've been affected, but you have to at least notify us that, hey, there's a possible problem here that we need to talk about, and it has to be in writing. And then it then triggers us to respond. It is up to each subcontractor and us to monitor the progress on the job. We need to alert others if there are potential issues that arise. Even if you have material availability issues, it's always good to let people know up front, if I can't get that block, I could typically get it in 4 weeks, but it won't come in 8. Let us know very early on, so maybe we can rearrange some things to accommodate that additional lead time. And as you know, lead times are just out of this world crazy with supply chain disruptions. And I think the last bullet is very important. You can be 100% correct, but if you don't notify us within the time frame identified in the subcontractor agreement, it doesn't matter. And although we would be cold-hearted not to recognize that you may have been damaged if it's been 3.5 days, but typically what happens is it's 3 months down the road that somebody says, oh, by the way, way back when you told me to wait on all these penetrations to go through this wall, I had to send my crews to a different job, and I had to lay a couple people's off because you weren't ready for me when you said you were. So anyways, that's just one example of that.
I'll just pile onto that a little bit too, because as Matt mentioned, maybe it's 3 days that's in our subcontract, but a lot of times that's tied to our owner agreement. The owner may say, well, they have a 5-day window, so we need time from the time we get a notice from our subcontractor to provide notice to our owner, so that we all stand the chance of having some equitable solution. And sometimes those dates and durations are negotiable and sometimes they're not. It really just depends on what we have agreed to in that owner agreement.
That's an excellent point, Mike, because that has happened where a subcontractor says, well, Messer, if you get 5 days, I want 5 days. I said, that's fine. We don't like that because of what you just said, Mike, that it doesn't give us time to collaborate and come up with a response, a collective response. Next slide, please.
There's a question here in the audience.
Quick question, just a point of order. By owner, do you mean like your client, or what do you, that term owner, what exactly does that mean?
Yes, that's our
Yeah,
client.
so the owner would be the customer that's building the building or ultimately paying for the project to be performed. No. Anywhere that we reference owner or prime agreement, that's the customer that's building the project.
Okay, design liability. As the workforce gets thinner and thinner, it not only affects trades, but it affects architects. And architects typically, or over the past several years, probably up to 10, they are issuing delegated design specifications. So delegated design means we kind of know what we want, but Mr. Subcontractor, you finish the design, you do all the calculations, make sure it's structurally sound and it fits within the parameters of the design, which is, it's quite frankly stinks because it just, every time I see delegated design, it tells me, why were they so lazy they couldn't at least give us more information? Or maybe they were rushed, but anyways. So then if you do have a delegated design, if you do have to, for instance, exterior stud framing on an exterior wall that has masonry laid up against it, has to be designed and certified and stamped by a certified structural engineer. So that's just to make sure that the product you're providing and all the details are not on the architectural. That's why they indicate that the final design is up to the subcontractor. Yeah, it's going to take some work because it takes some effort, but knowing that up front, you put in a couple $1,000s for design for someone to review and provide the details for how many screws it takes vertically and horizontally on a board on the exterior, where do the masonry clips need to be placed, and all the connection points and where the strapping and the bracing and the shear connections need to be. So it's really quite fascinating the amount of work it takes when design is passed down to a subcontractor, and it takes some forethought when you put your bid together. The one thing I would stay away from and run like crazy on any project that says the drawings and specifications are complementary, which is absolutely ridiculous in my opinion. When they're complementary, which that means that whether it's shown or not on the drawings, if it's mentioned in the specs and we need it, you got it. So for instance, on a project recently, we had a specification for gas pipe. It was a great spec, but there was nothing on the drawings. Well, there was no need for gas, so we didn't need to provide the gas pipe. Similarly, there was cable tray that was what was indicated in the specifications, not shown in the drawings, but they needed it. So they're complementary. It doesn't matter. You have it. It wasn't on the drawings. How do we pick it up in the bid? And the argument doesn't, if it's complementary, it doesn't matter. And that's, I would run from any project that has that. Okay.
One
Mike,
thing I'll
anything?
add on
Yeah.
delegated design and liability is Messer does what we call a post-bid review meeting, where we go through the scope and we vet the scope to make sure there aren't gaps and that both parties are in agreement and alignment of what is being contracted. And one of the questions, if there's delegated design, we will notify the contractor that we we will require $1 million in professional liability insurance. And sometimes the subcontractors will say, well, I don't have a licensed engineer. We say, well, it's not you specifically, the subcontractor, but you're delegating that responsibility to a supplier, maybe. You know, Clark Dietrich, if we bring up the exterior framing as an example, they have engineers on staff or engineers that review the drawings that come through their computer models. That is the professional that we're looking for the insurance from, not necessarily the subcontractor, but maybe the supplier that is supplying to the subcontractor. So sometimes those questions aren't asked and they're assumed, and you may not have included an independent engineer reviewing, stamping, sealing the drawings, providing calculations, but it's required. And that's an area that you could avoid up front if there's the open dialogue.
That's a great point, Mike, and you're right. That's all about communication, and whether it's notification or making sure we understand what you purchased or what we're purchasing from you. All right, claims for damages. This goes along with notifications. So after you notify us, say that you met the time limit on that, now it's up. It's you have a responsibility to then compile a reason why you sent that notification. So that notification, it could say, notify us in 3 days, but then 10 days thereafter, you must submit a request for delay or for a change order for additional cost, and it has to be justified. You have to prove that it was impactful to your schedule, to the critical path of your work. You'd have to prove that that the work was scheduled for 1 week and now it takes 2. But you can't just ignore the fact that, hey, I submitted a claim, now I got my rights available to the end of the job. It doesn't work that way. And again, just really ties back to notifying. So anything to add on that, Mike?
Yeah, I'd say most of the contracts that we enter into, we're relatively risk averse ourselves. And so we work with owners and customers that are good partners. And when I see this come to a project, and it is disheartening when you get to the end of a project and you didn't realize that a contractor was impacted because they just didn't share it until they get to the end, and they're looking at their total build amount and they're looking at their cost and saying, I'm upside down, and here's the reason. Well, it's way too late in most cases for us to really be able to do anything to help them. Whereas if you're providing that communication, the timely notices and the changes that are coming as you go, that gives us the opportunity to share that with our owners and to be reimbursed for those costs and to submit change orders to the subcontractor. So oftentimes I'd say 75–80% of the claims that are submitted are legitimate.
Mm-hmm. But
the timing of which they're submitted becomes very critical in whether or not we're able to process that, depending on the owner's willingness to cooperate. It's always best, early notification, and sometimes early notification allows us to catch a significant problem in the end and make it minor because we were able to work with the subcontractor supplier, do work in a different sequence to support being more productive and less costly in delivering the total project.
Okay. Next slide. Okay. So this is interesting. So consequential or liquidated damages. So the consequential damages, CDs, are economic damages incurred by the owner, by the people who hire the general contractor or construction manager as a result of performance. It's not for correcting work, it's for the loss of use of the space. So the second plus sign here types of issues are lost profits, brand identity, lost reputations. These are very, very burdensome because it's hard to quantify. And it's usually, for an example, if in fact I was to build a hotel and I said, I agree to get this hotel completed by December 31st, and you can start having people move in and rent hotel rooms on January 1. But due to my sloppiness in schedule, or maybe an award, maybe it's a month later I can deliver. Sorry, I can deliver it on February 1. Well, they would say that, okay, you've got 1,000 rooms that you're supposed to deliver. Each room is $1, and I could have gotten $1,000 every day, and I've lost all my rent for those 1,000 rooms. So you owe me $30,000. And imagine if that room is 100, you would quickly add up to $300,000 in damages because they couldn't rent the rooms. So that's a consequence of being late. So liquidated is a set agreement on saying that, hey, look, in most cases, there's no consequential damages, but we agree that if something happens where it's our negligence that causes the project to be delayed, that typically we would say, okay, fine. If it's something we did, we'll own up to it. And the liquidated damages could be a set agreement of anywhere from $1,000 to $5,000 to $10,000 a day. But at least it's quantifiable as opposed to consequential, which is how they run their business. And Mike, go through that example. That's interesting.
Yeah, so an example here is of a contractor who had $600,000 in fee on a total project, but due to the project being 4 months late, they were penalized $14.5 million. So the risk reward there, understand what are your risks versus what you have in as a potential reward for performing the work. I think if you're a general contractor, small general contractor, and you're listening to this in the next recording, if the owner agreement is silent to consequential or liquidated damages, it's in your best interest to negotiate something. And if you have a priority, it's liquidated damages. There are certain owners that will agree to $0 for liquidated damages for the first 20 days, and then maybe $1,000 a day after that. Just something that quantifies what that risk is for both parties at the current time and for future, because then it can be insured to an extent, or what the risk is. There are times where we may in an owner agreement say it's a bottling plant, and we understand if their production line is down for any period of time, they're not able to produce, and they may be a worldwide supplier. We do a lot of work with distilleries, so we may negotiate the consequential damages down to what our fee is on the job, so that if nothing else, if this job just had issues that we couldn't resolve, if nothing else, at the end of the day, we didn't go in the hole, but we didn't make money either. So those are some things to think about. Always prefer liquidated damages over consequential. And if you can, if the terms aren't identified, request that they do define something, even if it's 0 for a certain period of time before you have.
Okay, so then I'm a bit confused. So they are different, consequential versus liquidated damages.
Yes. So consequential, there is no limit. It could be whatever, if we do a lot of work with schools and universities. If we're turning over a dormitory, similar to the example that Matt had with the hotel. Well, if they have to find a place for those students to go live during that academic semester before the building is acceptable, not only do they have the lost revenue of what they have, but they have the additional expenses of putting kids up in other places. And then what is the brand reputation? How many students might leave or post on social media, how bad this experience is? Those are the things that you could get into a lawsuit that pins you down to even more than what is tangible. And again, this is more, probably not as much from a subcontractor standpoint of a risk. From a subcontractor standpoint, your liability is to the extent that you've delayed the critical path. So it's a fraction. If you've created the delay, and you're the whole reason of the delay, then yes, a lot of that's getting funneled down to you. But if it's through the duration of the project and you maintained your commitment, you maintain performance of the work while you were on site, that's going to be delegated down to the contractor that was liable or responsible for the delay.
Mike, that's an excellent point, and another reason to refer to the notifications that as long as you're upfront and notifying, this keeps all the communication lines open, and if you certainly don't want those to flow down to you. So anyways, next slide. Okay. This is, I think we addressed this earlier, but it can't spend enough time reading what it is you're signing up to do. And it's sometimes takes a while, and sometimes you might want to use it to fall asleep, but it's usually, if you're in business for yourself, you certainly want to know what you're getting involved in, and reading, understanding the contract agreement, request the prime agreement, and read that, make sure that anything that prime agreement requires of the construction manager or general contractor will be also passed along into the subcontractors. Yeah, and the consultants that you can trust, certainly the insurance and surety brokers regarding limits of insurance, accounting, attorneys, bankers, even a team of professional constructors who you can bounce ideas off of. And I think it's all about knowing what the risks are, seeing if they're negotiable, and understanding what is non-negotiable and what you can live with.
So as Annette mentioned, there are support and resources available, whether it's with Messer or, with any other general contractor you're performing work. Don't hesitate to reach out to NCDOA, MWBE, Coordinators Network, or MBDA for advice. These are organizations that can help point you in the right direction or provide the support that you might need. If you are working with Messer on a project, there are ways that we can support you in, once the risks are identified, how we can mitigate that risk together, whether it's how we break down a bid package, whether we encourage a joint venture between prime and sub to develop that mentor-mentee relationship, or bonding and insurance. We talked about that a little bit as well, and payment terms, as Matt mentioned earlier. We understand cash flow is an issue for all contractors, not just small contractors. And so knowing what those terms are that are you're able to work with up front is valuable to both parties. So to do business with Messer, I know we've talked about this in the previous presentations. There's a QR code here. I think on the next slide, there's a link, and you can go to messer.com and identify the link to register your company and get pre-qualified. With that, not only will you be able to do business with us, but you'll also be notified of upcoming bids and opportunities. We've shared with MBDA, Coordinators Network, the RDU project right now is in pre-qualification. And Matt, do you want to highlight that opportunity, what it is for December, as well as what's coming up first of next year?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So there are two projects. Currently, the project that is being advertised for pre-qualification is called the BU Cafe. And for some reason, cafe in this instance is spelled C-A-F-F-E. So, but BU is an established coffee vendor in downtown Raleigh, and they're also going to be opening two concessions in pre-security, one in Terminal 1, one in Terminal 2. It's basically a refresh of an existing Starbucks. So we're gonna remove some stuff, clean a lot of things, put a new coat of paint on the walls, maybe some new flooring, patching this, patching that. And that's the current project that is being advertised for. We expect that to bid in late November. Anywhere from, and it has everything from cleaning services, temporary partitions, to the chipboard patch and repair, painting, very minor HVAC, a little bit of plumbing, some electric. It's a small scope of work, but it's we certainly want to make sure that we make the opportunities available for anybody who has the ability to do that work. And then further down the line, over at the first of the year, we'll be advertising for 3 concessions in Terminal 2. So there's three concessions will be removed, and we're going to install or provide or build another 3 new concessions, and that could lead to maybe 12 or 14 down the road. So we're hoping that this really turns into a 2 or 3 year project. So a lot of work coming out at RDU.
So then probably since it's the airport one, it's going to be the DBE certification that will be key as opposed to hub, correct? Right,
Correct. I think
because that's the client, federal. So if you're not a DBE, you need to get DBE. Yeah.
well, they do recognize women.
So anytime you're dealing with an airport, you know, airports are wonderful things, but you got to realize there's like 4 lines of business going on. You have the airline that comes in, right? Delta, whatever, they have their own supply chain, that's fine. Opportunity there. They pull into the airport, and the airport's considered quasi-government, right? So it's like Raleigh-Durham Airport, right? They have the money, but usually it's the federal government that gives them money to finish the runway. And the minute you get $1 of federal money, you're subject to federal DBE goals. Okay, so now it's not just a city of Raleigh hub or state certification. You have to have the DBE certification. Okay, and then in the airport itself, you have the airport concessionaire, right? Which you, if you want to sell goods and stuff, you can be an AC airport concessionaire DBE. So again, it's following the money.
Yeah,
Right.
sometimes it's very specific to where the funding is coming
Yes.
from, and Matt would have to speak on this project as to
Yeah.
if you're
So-
NCDOT
Mhm.
or SBA or
Yeah.
hub
Yeah.
certification.
Yeah,
What's
so always
satisfied.
follow the money because that's what the certification is, usually follows the requirement. So that's what's been interesting about this federal flow through money, the ARPA money, the infrastructure money. It's federal dollars, but it's going through the state, right? And the state's administering it. So we put on the hub certification or DOT if the DOT's
Mhm.
administering some of that money. So it's not a clear cut thing, but for airports generally, you have to be a DBE. So.
Well, this project isn't isolated just to DBEs. Wherever the money is wherever the money is coming from, we recognize the M, the W, the S, and the D.
What you see on the slide now is just more information about pre-qualification. And then last slide, just open it back up to any questions, any final questions or comments? So the question is, does MESA require certification to work with us? And we don't require certification to work with us, but in order for us to track it as spent dollars with MWBE, we only recognize that if it's through a certified organization. So we strongly encourage our subcontractors, if they can meet those requirements, to go ahead and get certified.
They said 90 to 120 days to get that, if everything's perfect. So I was just wondering if there are opportunities outside of that, or it's just, you have to have that DBE.
There's opportunities outside of that for sure. And we recognize for our spend, whether it's whatever the project is, wherever it's at, if you're certified through NCDOT or SBA we recognize those as certifications. So unless there's a more stringent requirement based on funding with an airport or something like that, would that come into play? But again, to maximize your opportunities, depending on the area of focus or which market segment you want to work in, you should be conscious about what is that risk and reward? How challenging is it? What is that return on the investment?
The opportunities.
Yeah.
Working.
Yeah. Because it might not be for that airline, but it might be, right? Or if you see one of their 6 lines of businesses, airports, it will show up one day. I
Right.
guarantee you as a DVD.
Right.
Because they want to meet their goals too.
Sure.
And I'll also say that if you are certified and there's a term for that certification, it's a lot easier to renew prior to the end of the term than having to go through that whole enrollment and registration process. Be conscious of that.
DBE and SBA certifications are, they're federal, so they're standard, across the states. But for something like the NC Hub certification, which is a state level, unutilized business certification, and you don't necessarily have that in other states. So I don't even think Ohio has that kind of program.
But they do.
So how do you?
There are different organizations in other states that have similar programs. So in Nashville, I spent 10 years with Messer in Nashville before coming to Raleigh, and the Airport Authority in Nashville, Metro Nashville Airport Authority, MNAA, has a certification that is recognized that most other agencies will utilize that as a certifiable organization. So it depends on which region you're in, which state you're in. Generally, there's a leading organization that is recognized as the certifying organization.
Some don't. So just curious when you're talking about national, national companies, but you definitely do recognize our hub.
Oh, yes.
At the state level. Regarding how firms know about your opportunities. So I know on the page that you showed, you were specific to a set of opportunities, but is that something where once they sign up, they will get notification of any opportunities that come through, or do they need to come back to a particular website and check periodically?
So we use that database anytime we are soliciting subcontractors. So if the work is within the state of North Carolina, pretty much anyone that's registered, and as you pre-qualify, you identify which regions that we're in that you do work in. And so anytime there's an open bid, you'll get a notification. It may be I square foot, or it may be solicited through a local, like the RDU webpage. But that you'll be triggered to go to review that bid opportunity. Yes, well, we are sharing communications to try to get more of that in front of organizations that then can communicate that down to the network. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to get to know most of you over the course of the 6 weeks. Hope you enjoy your Halloween.
Well, thank you again, Mike and Messer Construction, and we hope to continue with the Mentoring Monday and some other opportunities to share knowledge. So if you ever need us to host an outreach session for your opportunities, we'd love to be able to do that. So just let us know. All right. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.